I'm going to be talking about gender and gender justice under illiberal rule. You all know that gender and sexuality have become central themes in illiberal politics. So gender is not really just sort of a superficial phenomenon that we observe when it comes to authoritarianization. It's not just sort of an add-on to illiberalism. It's actually a constitutive feature. And I'm going to start from that assumption, and I'm going to show you why that is true and why that should be taken seriously. You may be familiar with, sort of, a few years ago, I formulated a concept that I call carefare, and I argued that illiberal politicians are introducing a new form of statecraft, which is, I called it carefare, basically introduced a new logic of social citizenship. And that social citizenship is based on birthing and raising children. And I argued that these policies, on the one hand, radical pronatalist policies, and on the other, policies that target gender equality, so basically, try and diminish gender equality, and or are ignorant of problems connected to gender equality, lead to or create a welfare state where the most generous subsidies are allocated on the basis of care responsibilities, specifically care responsibilities for children, raising and birthing and raising children. These welfare states that have taken shape in different illiberal countries are quite different in the degree of their selectivity. It's extremely selective in Hungary, much less selective in Poland, and take different shapes, but generally. But I think that principle of transforming social citizenship rights and the principle of social citizenship is shared, and is, as such, an integral and important part of what illiberalism is. Now, okay, but that was in the past. So now moving on, I think there's another really important question that we need to ask that you political scientists don't tend to ask, if I may be so provocative. And this is a question that sociologists typically ask, but somehow sociologists don't tend to write that much about illiberalism. And the question then is, what exactly is the impact of illiberal rule on gender justice? Now, there are lots of good reasons why this has not been studied, because it has not or has barely been studied. One reason is that there's not a lot of data to be had. The second is that the lifespan of this regime is fairly short. But not that short anymore, and there is some data already, with variable reliability. So I think it's time that we look at the impact of illiberal rule on social justice. So how illiberal politicians transform not just politics, not just institutions of democracy, but social inequalities, social structure, the social fabric of our lives. So to take a very first tentative step, I looked at opinions. So how illiberal, because there's a lot of rhetoric, illiberal rhetoric that we encounter every day, so it makes sense to expect that this rhetoric will impact the way people think about their variety of issues, specifically in my case, or in the case that I'm interested in, gender relations. I used the data from the ISSP, the International Social Survey Project, which just recently released its last wave, which is about gender issues. So people's opinion about gender issues. And so I'm going to show you a few charts, and I'm going to argue that illiberal propaganda, or illiberalism, if you like, illiberal political discourse, did not actually stop, but sort of slowed a secular trend towards the acceptance of gender and sexual equality. This is strange because we typically think of illiberal discourse as extremely patriarchal. But in fact, if you look at how people talk about or what people think, the views and opinions they express, we don't see that degree of patriarchy or patriarchal domination or patriarchal ideas reflected in their views. There's a difference between illiberal countries or countries which experienced lengthier illiberal rule and those that didn't, but the trend is similar. And you see that Eastern and Western Europe is going in the same direction, but you also see a huge gap, a widening gap between the two parts of the continent. And that leads me to argue that the legacy of state socialism is important. Not just possibly state socialism, but the legacy of post-state socialism now. So what came after state socialism is important and may in fact override or certainly combine, is combined with the impact of illiberal political rhetoric in shaping the way people think about gender relations, sexual rights, and generally gender equality. So I'm going to show you a few tables. Actually, no, well, no, I have time. So there are good reasons to suggest or to expect that democratization will lead to more gender equality. This is a table that shows that more democratic countries are more gender equal. So you would expect that de-democratization, less democracy would be leading to the opposite. But it's also well known that in some parts of the world, authoritarian rule or authoritarianization has in fact increased gender equality in at least some areas. So the question of whether or not illiberalism is going to have a positive or negative impact on gender equality or people's views on gender equality is far from clear. Here I'm going to show you a few charts, and I will show you a few first, few areas where where illiberalism, I feel, made a difference, and that is in the field of the number of births. That's not about opinions, but that's actual, tangible facts. The rates of poverty, and people's degree of overwork. And then I'll show you a few charts that show that illiberalism does not have much of an effect. State socialism or post-state socialism seems to be the driving force, or seems to be making a difference in the average opinion of people in different countries. So here's the fertility rate, where you see a difference between, where you actually see illiberal pro-natalist policies making a difference. Even though, nope, that doesn't quite work. That doesn't really work. You can't see you can't see. And in any case, what you see is that the birth rate, the fertility rate, the total fertility rate increased both in Hungary, more in Hungary than in Poland, after the introduction of pro-natalist policies, even though it started to decline after 2020, but in Hungary it has picked up again. So even though the number of births is not increasing, and the number of Hungarians is sadly declining, but the actual fertility rate, so the actual number of children that women give birth to, is higher than it was in 2010, and is increasing again now that the government has introduced some new policies. The same is not true in Poland, where the fertility rate went down to levels, never before seen levels. So in Hungary, Hungarian pro-natalist policies did have an impact on the number of children every individual woman is likely to have, which is significant. Every child is, the larger families shape the distribution of reproductive work within the family and outside of the family. So this would be expected to have longer-term consequences. Another area where illiberalism made a difference is social well-being. And basically, in illiberal countries, this care-fare regime transferred the risk of poverty from the elderly to people, no, the other way around. Transferred the risk of poverty from people with children to the elderly. You see the poverty risk of people over 65 increasing this is Hungary, increasing in Hungary, and the poverty and the risk of poverty decrease with children, for people with children, decreasing in Hungary. So basically, there's a certain amount of money that got, redistributed from, say, the level of pensions to pro-natalist policies. And what you see is that in illiberal Hungary, the poverty rate for children and also families with a large number of children declined quite significantly over the past 15 years. And finally, here's another lovely chart where you see an interesting difference between illiberal countries and and also more liberal democracies. Here I compare Hungary, Austria, the Czech Republic, Slovakia, and France. And what you see is that in Hungary, Poland, and Slovakia, which would be classified as more illiberal, more people are saying that they're too tired from housework to function at their paid work. This is significant because, again, if there are more children born, if the regime expects women to be doing expects women and families to be doing reproductive work, and instead of supporting state institutions to do that, then you would expect people to be more tired, to be more exhausted from domestic work. And to the extent that that's true for illiberal countries, you see that there's a difference. Now, the difference was always there already in 2002 between Hungary, so for Hungary and Poland, but Slovakia kind of, no, Hungary actually. Hungary kind of climbed up over the past 10 years. Again, arguably, this is the result of illiberal pro-natalist policies which create more reproductive burden for families and specifically for women. Okay, but there are lots of areas, and particularly in opinions and views on gender, where illiberalism did not seem to have made a huge difference. And that's surprising because the discourse, political discourse, was nothing but, addressed nothing but these issues. So here's the percent of people who agree with the statement, a man's job is to earn money and a woman's is to look after the family. And what you see here is that indeed people in Slovakia and Hungary, and but then of course also in the Czech Republic and Poland, are more likely to agree with this statement than people in France or in Austria, or Germany this time, Germany or Austria. But this was true already in 2002, and the gap, if anything, say between Germany and Slovakia, for example, or Hungary, increased. Not so much because those countries changed, but because the Germans became, or particularly maybe Austrians, have become significantly more liberal or less likely to agree with this patriarchal claim. So the argument is, so what you see here is the legacy of state socialism. State socialist countries have not changed very much in the way they view gender equality. It's difficult to, again, you could argue that that illiberal politics, sort of the anti-gender discourse that we hear, impacted this, but it impacted it to the extent that it did not move in the same direction or at the same speed towards a more liberal dimension as it did as opinions change in Western European countries. Here, Germany and Austria are two examples, but if I had included any of the other Western European countries that participated in the ISSP, you would have seen this exactly the same pattern. Again, very similar results for a different statement. Men are better suited for high political or high academic or high any kind of office than women. And what you see is that people in Eastern European countries are much more likely to agree with this statement, irrespective of how long they experienced an illiberal government or authoritarian, how long they experienced de-democratization. And similarly, when it comes to whether or not people agree that lesbian couples are just as well positioned as heterosexual couples to raise children. I didn't even separate illiberal and non-illiberal countries here because the difference is, again, clearly between CEE, Central and Eastern European, and non-Central and Eastern European countries. And you see how the gap is increasing. But again, the gap is not just increasing between Hungary and Germany, but the gap is also increasing between the Czech Republic and Germany. That's the point I'm trying to make. So in conclusion, I think it is, this is really just a few tentative points that I wanted, that I'm trying to make here. But I really think it's important to start studying the social impact of illiberalism, the way in which illiberal rule has impacted inequalities, how it reshaped inequalities, how it reorganized the position and positioned differently different social groups, and how it changed, or not, people's opinion of a variety of issues. And to do so, I think it's important to reach back well before the 2010s, because the impact of illiberalism is combined with the legacies of state socialism, and how exactly these different kinds of path dependencies combine that's something that needs to be sort of studied a lot more carefully than these few charts that I managed to show you here. Thank you.